Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our very first virtual talk series, Up Close, Stories, Objects, and Ideas from Beyond the Galleries. My name is Eleonora Sermoneta. I'm the adult learning programmer here at the Royal Alberta Museum, and I will be the host during this talk. So before we start, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that the land upon which we stand is Treaty 6 territory, the traditional territory of the Cree and Nakota peoples, and a homeland to the Métis. This space continues to be a gathering place for generations of Dene, Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, Saulteaux, and Inuit people. We honor the cultures, languages, and histories of the indigenous peoples of this land. As I mentioned, this is our first up-close talk, so let me give you a quick orientation. During this session, we will have a presentation by one of our museum experts, followed by a Q&A session. Today's talk is called Mysteries Melting from the Ice. We are going to learn about preserved plants, animal remains, and objects that lie enclosed in the ice patches scattered among the mountains. These objects have compelling stories and offer us a glimpse into what these landscapes may have been like thousands of years ago. Please know that you're more than welcome to ask questions to our museum experts and myself, of course. You can type your questions in the chat. I'm going to do my very best to monitor the chat and relay your questions to our expert during the Q&A segment. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce our museum expert, Diana Tirlea, Assistant Curator of Quaternary Environments. Diana has worked as the Assistant Curator of Quaternary Environment at the Royal Alberta Museum since December 2012. Her past experiences include working as a wildlife rehabilitator and environmental consultant. Diana holds a Bachelor of Science degree in zoology and a Master of Science degree in ecology from the University of Alberta. Her thesis focused on determining if input on terrestrial-derived nutrients, like pollen grains, into small alpine lakes influenced the productivity of these ecosystems. She also investigated changes in vegetation occurrence, abundance, and distribution in response to changing climates. As Assistant Curator of Quaternary Environments program, she works to maintain the diverse collection, including the seed, pollen, and Tephra reference collection. And she conducts research, primarily focusing on the reconstruction of past landscapes in the Canadian Rocky Mountains during the last 12,000 years. This research is completed through identifying and counting subfossil pollen grains and macrofossils preserved in lake sediments and organic deposits and ice. Some of the exciting projects she's currently working on includes looking at plant material retrieved from pack rat dung deposits in mountain caves and dated over 10,000 years old, and working on microfossils and pollen recovered from 7,000 years old ice patches in the Canadian Rocky Mountains. Recovered remains like these are used to get a sense of what past landscapes looked like in Alberta during the Holocene and to better understand environmental changes. She also works with modern samples. For example, one collaborative project she's currently working on involves counting 1,000 pollen grains recovered from rangeland pollinators, such as bees and flies, to better understand pollinator-pollination interactions in the prairies. On a personal note, Diana is passionate about many things revolved around nature, including backpacking, gardening, and nature photography and painting. She also enjoys writing, listening to diverse music, running, and baking bread. I guess that many of us picked up this skill during the pandemic, right? Okay, I'm going to pass the microphone to Diana. And again, please feel free to use the chat if you have any questions for myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Eleonora, for the introduction. That was really awesome. And you captured some things I'll be talking about today for sure. So that's great. So everyone should be able to see a presentation now. So I'll be going through mostly talking about the ice patch project that Eleonora mentioned and the tiny things we can find in there. So as Eleonora said, I'm Diana Tirlea. I work in the Quaternary Environments program. And this is a really important time period. So it's about the last 12,000 years. And why this is important, it's basically the start of a geological time period, the Holocene, which we're in now. And it's also important because just before this, we were looking at the last glacial maximum, which is about 20 to 24,000 years. And most of Alberta at that time was covered by these massive ice sheets, kilometers thick. And really how the landscape started becoming what it looks like today is when those ice sheets started to retreat. And the plants were able to move in and migrate into Alberta from the south and the east and along the Rockies. So as we just kind of touch base, that's what we're going to be investigating, is about the last 12,000 years. And we're going to do this investigation through looking at what I like to call little tiny treasures in the landscape. They're amazing to work with and they give us a lot of information. Now, what are these treasures that I'm talking about? So here are a bunch of images to show the diversity of what I will be talking about today. So in the Quaternary Environments program, we work on paleo-environmental studies, and that encompasses looking at things called macrofossils and microfossils. And they're not true fossils in the sense of like dino bones, which are, mineralized and basically rocks. We can often refer to these as subfossils, but it's a term we use in paleo-environmental studies. So when you look at these images here, the majority of the darker brown colored specimens here are macrofossils, and those pink colored or dyed elements are pollen. So, and those are our microfossils. So let's talk about macrofossils first. So I'll just kind of show you a little bit of what these are that you're looking at. So just starting at the top left there, we have a piece of insect, so exoskeleton. And then next beside that is our sedge akene. It's a type of fruit, so the seed is actually inside. And then right beside that is some willow capsules, which is another type of fruit, and the seeds are inside. So saying that, a lot of the stuff we're finding is actually a type of fruit. An example of that is like dandelions, like, the ones that blow in the wind. Kids really like to play with them. That's actually a type of fruit at the base with the seed inside. So that's what's being preserved in the environment too. At the bottom left there, we have some dung, and that's from a herbivore. And right beside that is a leaf fragment, and that's coming from mountain abbins. And all of these are considered macrofossils, macro referring to larger, because they're typically a few millimeters to a few centimeters in size. And oftentimes, some of the more robust ones are the ones that are preserving. So a good example of that here is this leaf. You can kind of tell by this image here alone that it's quite robust. So things like this or conifer needles are really preserved in the environment versus, say, very thin and fragile parts of the plant. And what these are telling too, the macrofossils are telling you a lot about the local environment. So that's a few meters from the sampling site or the study area. So they're telling you presence and absence of certain types of species. And they're not typically as abundant as the pollen we're going to talk about, although you can get thousands of seeds in a lake sediment sample, like from example, cattails. So that being said, let's move on to the microfossils. So that's these all pink dyed elements. So we do dye them when we're processing them so we can see them better. And some examples here, we have this one core pollen grain is from a group of plants, grasses, and then the one right beside it is willow. So that's actually a willow pollen grain, whereas you have that willow macrofossil above of it. And that points out to the part that we want to look at multiple proxies of past landscapes. It really helps to strengthen our interpretation of the landscape. So these microfossils are tiny, micro. So all of these elements you see here, we do use microscopes. But the pollen, we definitely do need a microscope to see these and count them. And they're usually in the range on average of 40 microns. And in 1 millimeter, you have 1,000 microns or micrometers. And 40 microns is like about the diameter of a thin strand of hair. So pretty tiny stuff. Also, the thing about pollen too, it occurs in the thousands in the environment. And how this happens is if you think about one type of plant, the anthers, so that's where the pollen is being produced, it could have a few to thousands of pollen grains just from that one anther. So then if you look at the flower or the plant shoot, you could have millions depending on the type of plant. Plants that are pollinated by insects and other animals typically produce less pollen than, say, airborne plants like many of our trees and conifers in Alberta, as well as grasses. So they're really distributed abundantly in the environment. Not all of them end up on the stigma, the female part of the plant, where they result in pollination. Many of them are put and redistributed into the environment. So that's what we're dealing with here. Also, an interesting thing here about pollen is it often tells you a lot of information about the regional or the broader landscape. So those are the distant landscapes from the site, so kilometers away. So your forest and surrounding area. But it can also have elements of pollen, for example, the insect pollinated pollen that will tell you information about the local environment, so closer to the sampling site. So where do we find these kind of fossils? So these are some representations of places we can find these. And not all sites are the best place to preserve them. And not all types of macro and microfossils preserve the same way. So one thing about pollen is it does have a pretty strong outer wall, which can be highly resistant to the environmental context, like changes in pH and so on. Whereas, like I said before, macrofossils can be a little bit more sensitive depending on what type. But some of the best places to find this material is lake cores. So this is a few meters high lake core that we're taking during the winter at Hassey Lake here in Alberta. And the really cool thing about coring too is we can do it in wintertime. We can do summer coring too, but in wintertime it has some advantages because it has a nice ice platform for us to work on. So it's much easier to deal with than getting out there on a boat and rigging it up to make it steady and so on. So some really good advantages there. And get some pretty long and thick cores doing this too. And there's no picture of this here, but peatlands are very similar. We take long cores out of those too. And the reason these are some of the best sites for preservation is because, first of all, they often sites that we target are not being redistributed, like the mud's not getting mixed up and so on. So it provides us a platform to have a chronology or an age model so we know how old everything is. So every year, materials being deposited on top of each other, forming that like age model here. So what that means is the top of the core would be your most modern or youngest, and the bottom would be the oldest. Another reason is a lot of these environments like lake basins and peatlands provide environments that will help preserve the material. And that kind of environment looks like little oxygen and low microbial activity. So there's not a bunch of like bacteria and fungus breaking down that plant material, as well as not a huge change in wet and drying elements. So you're not drying up the sample, then wetting it, then drying it. When we have it in a water basin like this, then it's going to stay moist. So that's a really positive thing for preserving this material. But aside from those really great areas to find it, we are looking and investigating other places. So for example, there's archaeological dig sites, and at the museum, we do have a lot of archaeologists working there too. And we can take samples there for macro and microfossils. For example, if there's a hearth, you can take samples from there. They're often charred, and you can look at to see what kind of plant material is being collected and used in food making. Another potential is caves. There's actually quite a few caves in Alberta, and we have some researchers at the museum working with bones found in caves. So we're also trying to explore to see if we can find pollen and macrofossil remains in caves as well. And something a little bit newer that I've been exploring is looking at macrofossils and pollen in ice. So this is a glacier up here on the top middle image there. And this dark blob here is actually a remnant of that glacier. So we've been taking samples there and finding some really interesting things. And this right here is an ice patch. So today we're going to focus on ice patches as the main site of getting these samples from. So what is an ice patch? So an ice patch is actually part of the cryosphere. That's our frozen water that is part of our landscape here. So that encompasses things like glaciers that we know of, those large massive ice sheets like in Greenland, as well as the snow and other frozen elements, permafrost, and so on. So that's what our ice patch is. But it is different than, for example, a glacier that we may be more familiar with. And one of the key features and differences here is that they are typically stagnant. So they're not heavy enough and they're not big enough to move on their mass downslope like glaciers do. And what that actually does too, because it's not moving about, and when glaciers move, it's not just external movements, it's also internal ice deformations. So glaciers are grinding on the base as well as inside, which is not great for preserving things. But these ice patches are actually, because they're stagnant, they're able to kind of behave like an ice base, sorry, a lake basin. So you can see in this image, these lines, which are layers of organic material. And that's kind of acting like that lake basin because it indicates that materials may be depositing on top of the surface and accumulating every single year, like we were talking about earlier. So that's something we wanted to explore. And also these ice patches are basically occurring in the same areas as glaciers. They're more high altitude and they're often north facing too. They have that ice core too, which helps to keep them permanent or occur in the environment and landscape for several years. So, you know, when you think of the Rockies, like I often think of massive things like the massive mountains and also how a lot of places are bare. I often reflect on all the snow and the big glaciers. Here we're approaching two ice patches. One's long and linear and one's kind of circular on the front. And really, to me, they don't look super profound in the landscape. So, you know, as a researcher, you start asking what kind of information can you get from these really seemingly small features in the landscape? And how can we use these small features to learn more about the past, about the animals and about the plants, as well as about maybe the history of people? And this is one element that we could learn about, is the history of people through ice patch research. And so ice patch research, and specifically ice patch archaeology, really didn't get started up until about the late 1990s. And when this got started up, the reason being is it was actually strongly correlated with climate change, which was causing, you know, a loss of ice mass and melting of some of these features like the ice patches. And when they were melting out, they were releasing artifacts up on the screen. These artifacts were being found along the margin of ice patches, and it sparked a lot of excitement. Archaeologists were really pumped about this because typically in Alberta, like if you find, say, a technology, you will find these points, which are the mineral and the rock components. But what's coming out of these ice patches, which is shown here, is organic material tied with these artifacts. And this was super exciting. It gave archaeologists more information about the actual technology, and it also allowed you to directly date the artifact because you could use the organic material in it and date that. So it's pretty amazing. We have here some images here. There's a moccasin this, and this is all from the Yukon, artifacts coming out from ice patches there. The moccasin's about 1,000 years old. You can see how well preserved it is for that because it was entombed in the ice. And then to the right there, there's a copper arrowhead with an antler end on it. And this was really cool find. It's about 850 years old, and it's one of the earliest records of this kind of technology. And that copper is actually locally sourced. It's not an indication of trade or anything like that. So it's pretty exciting stuff. And another thing that's coming out of these records is a transition between different technologies. So on the bottom left there, we have a series of atlatls, and that's a type of technology, a throwing dart. And this was more prevalent between 9,000, 1,200 years. And then it was a switch over to this bow and arrow technology around 900. So it's pretty amazing stuff that's coming out of here. And just before I go into the rest of the presentations about Alberta and what we're doing, just quick note that there's actually a really cool documentary, Nature of Things, that you can check out on YouTube that's all about the Yukon ice patches. And it's called Secrets of the Ice, David Suzuki. So definitely check that out. So going from here, what's happening in Alberta then? And before we talk about that too, let's talk about why these artifacts are actually coming out and why we're looking at ice patches. And that has to do with the fact that caribou were really strongly relied on in northern Canada. So they were an important food source and used for other resources. And these ice patches were important because caribou actually went and concentrated around these features. Why were they concentrating around these features? Because caribou are cold adapted animals. And in the summertime, they often experience hotter temperatures and their bodies are getting too hot, as well as a lot of biting flies occur in the north, and they're like really pestering these caribou. So they seek out these ice patches, which helps reduce their body temperature, as well as helps to fend off those biting insects. So they're saving a lot of energy by keeping around these ice patches. So they don't have to spend time cooling down or shaking to get rid of the bugs. And people with their wonderful knowledge and their technologies and cultures up there realize this. And these ice patches, these caribou would go to every year. They would return to them. So knowing this, hunting was occurring at these sites. And because of the hunting occurring at the site, technologies, weapons, and other belongings were being left behind here. And along with the fact that this is ice and snow, it was able to preserve these materials really well. So this is why a lot of these artifacts are being associated with these in the Yukon, Northwest Territory, and other parts of the world like Norway and Europe. They're also finding quite a few artifacts too like this. So yeah, let's head into ice patch research in Alberta. So because of the 1990s finds up north, it really ignited this exploratory kind of projects in other parts of the world, including in Alberta, like in Jasper and surrounding parts like Wilmore. But they were an exploratory kind of project, so therefore they had limited ice patches surveyed and they didn't spend a lot of time on it. So there was no real finds coming out of this. It wasn't until about 2015 when this kind of became a regular survey and project that was started by Parks Canada and Archaeological Survey of Alberta. And this was ignited through a find in 2009, which is this middle image, the wood shafts. There was 2 of them, and they were dated around 2400 and 230 years. So that kind of sparked that. And after these surveys became a bit regular, they were finding some other things. For example, there was this leather strap that was around 300 years. So some things were starting to come out of doing some more regular surveys, which is really important because once the artifacts melt out, they are organic based and they're going to decay quite quickly. So it's important to do those regular surveys and at certain timings. For example, high melt years. Those are the best times to get out there. So what other stuff were they finding now with these regular surveys? There's also a lot of finds of different faunal remains. And this is an image of bison bone, and then we have some caribou remains there too. And these are really important because they build the story of the landscape, which is what we're trying to do. So they're giving context into what kind of large hoofed animals are around these areas and what kind of animals would have been a potential resource and source for people living there. Also, of course, this is an organic material and bone is, we can date it and do radiocarbon dating. So we have some more information there. So I guess you could ask then, okay, so up north, they're finding these, artifacts because it's associated with a place that they go hunting and they collect a resource, the caribou. So doesn't Alberta have caribou? Yeah, we have populations of caribou, but we also have historical populations occurring in Alberta and the Rockies. But the one main difference here that we're finding so far with the ice patches we investigated is that there is no real evidence of heavy use of these ice patches by caribou. Up north, you have layers of caribou dung preserved in the ice of these ice patches that these artifacts are being recovered from. And also, not just layers, when the ice patch is actually completely gone, it'll leave this dark mass on the ground, and it's actually caribou dung. Whereas in Alberta, we haven't seen that so far with the ice patches that we've investigated. So just to kind of recap what we talked about before we go a little bit further into this, I just want to show some differences. So when you're thinking of some ice patch archaeology and research up north, there are some major differences here because there's evidence of caribou through these layers of dung in the ice, as well as leftover dung once it's melting out, that there's been heavy and consistent and persistent use by caribou on these ice patches, which would be important for people to know and to use and have that knowledge where to go to hunt the caribou. Also associated with that is all of these artifacts coming out. So there's tons of artifacts, hundreds found up there. So it's showing this tie between that connection of the caribou present there and the artifacts associated with those ice patches. Whereas in Alberta, so far what we're finding is that we're finding some faunal remains of animals like bison that have historically been in these areas and mountains. You may have heard of some of the reintroduction programs they're doing in the mountains. And as we know in Alberta, bison were the animals that were really important and valuable for Indigenous people in the past and now. So they may have not even needed to rely on if there's caribou around there. But so far, we're not seeing evidence that caribou were around there very much using those ice patches. Also associated with that lack of evidence of caribou using these ice patches is also limited artifacts that are being found too. So those are some differences and some things we've chatted about. So let's dive a little bit more into ice patch archaeology and paleo-environmental implications that we can use. So because we don't have these, these big finds like the Yukon, it doesn't mean that we're done here. First of all, we need to increase our efforts and the amount of ice patches that are surveyed. We need to get out there every year and survey for those artifacts. And secondly, we need to try and explore those elements of ice patch research that has not been explored that much so far, and that includes paleo-environmental studies, which encompasses looking at microfossils and macrofossils. And by doing this, we can get a better understanding of the landscape, which is relevant to human history too, to understand what kind of resources were available there. It's also relevant to understand what kind of habitat was available for different types of animals too. So it's giving us a lot of information. So how do we go about doing this? So the first thing we do and how we start this process is actually we do surveys of around the margins of the ice patch, just like looking for artifacts. And this is because we're looking to recover different plant materials that are typically larger, but are typically also wood. And what does this tell us? This actually gives us a lot of good information about tree line dynamics, or how the forest moved upslope and or recessed downslope as climate changed during this Holocene. So a good example here is there's a paper that's been published out here, and some finds in Colorado and their ice patches is they've recovered a bunch of sections of Engelmann spruce. And they're quite large, some of these sections. And these sections are melting right out of the ice patches, where they're at this site, there is no current forest. The closest forest is several hundred meters away, and that's comprised of an open sparse forest. So what this is indicating is that there was actually a mature forest, pretty large trees right there at this site. So right there is giving us that tree line dynamic information. Another interesting thing about this too is they've dated this material and it came back at around 4,200 years before present. And this is actually a really interesting time globally. There's a bunch of climate anomalies globally during this period. And specifically looking at just Western Canada, this was a time of ice advances, which we call neoglacial periods, as well as general cooling. And, you know, some of the things that could be associated with that is, of course, colder temperatures, but also increased snow and persistence and depth. This can actually kill trees, as well as the direct ice advances, which can kill trees and stuff like that too. So by looking at this information, then also because it's a large section, they can look at tree rings and look at when the seedling established here. They can understand when the forest was around here, around 4,600, and then when there was that neoglacial event causing some forest recession around 4,200 years. And then here, so in the ice patches we're looking at, we're discovering some of smaller pieces of fragments, but they're quite relevant too. So the forest is not near our site either, it's several hundred meters away too. And this piece of wood fragment here is dated just under 7,000 years old too. And it was found near the ice margin too. So some really good information initially. So how about all those tiny things we were talking about earlier? Well, all you have to do is go on top of an ice patch and look at the surface, and you can see the start of the process of that layer of organics being accumulated every year, being pushed down into the ice, being part of that, and stacking up every year. So again, kind of reaffirming that these ice patches are similar to what those lake basins are doing with macrofossils and microfossils. So very cool. So what do I mean by that? You know, that stacking. Let's take a close look at the side. So here we go in front of the ice patch face here. And as you can see here, the very top of that sampling point is going to be the more modern or younger samples. And then near the base is going to be the oldest. So that is what I mean by kind of mimicking an a lake sediment core. So how we sample this material is actually a simple method of using a chainsaw and taking out blocks. And there's some benefits to that. The benefits is we're getting a larger surface area, so we can get enough of that plant material in one layer to date, as well as to provide interpretation of the landscape. And there's other methods, of course. So the ice sheets, they're coring them, right? Ice cores, and there's augering of ice also. And then in Europe, they're doing some really cool stuff with ice patches where they actually tunnel through the ice patch, go right in the middle, and then clean out around and form an internal core, which is where they're sampling and getting information from. So there's different methods of doing this. So once we have these ice blocks, what do we do with them? So we take them back to the lab to process them. We can clean it off, reduce any contaminants and so on. And then we can identify those organic layers, which are these dark layers here. That's a really distinct one. That layer goes right through the ice block. And this is actually another layer too, not as distinct in this image, but it goes right through the block. It's a little bit dirty here. These are not true layers. They don't have any organic material. They're actually sediments, a lot of mineral and inwash from the surrounding scree and sediment there. So after we get that layer, we start the process by processing for macrofossils. And this is actually a really straightforward, simple process. We basically take that layer, we target it, thaw it down, and we just pour it through a series of stacked sieves. And the sieves have different mesh sizes, like the size of the hole. So we start with the larger mesh size to the smaller one at the bottom. And right here in the top right image there, you can see that top sieve has captured a lot of organic material. And that really dark stuff, almost black, that's organic leaves and so on. And the more grayish looking stuff is the sediment and rocks. So straightforward process. But we don't just get rid of all that water and solution. Be our next step. And our next step is to process it for pollen. So we start with the macros, which are larger, and then the catch of the smaller elements, right? So this is where all our pollen grains are. But what we need to do when we have like a big sample of sediment, or we have piece of mud, we need to concentrate the pollen so we can actually easily count it and look at it. So we go in a lab at a fume hood. This is our old museum. We go under the fume hood and use some pretty harsh chemicals like hydrofluoric acid, sulfuric acid. And what we're using those chemicals for is to get rid of all the organics or some of the sediment stuff, you know, and just concentrate pollen, spores, and some other plant remains. And we dye it in the process, and that's why it's pink. So it visually stands out. There's good contrast, so we can actually see that. So once we have everything out, how do we identify it? Well, the cool thing about museums is museums are full of collections, but a lot of these are also reference collections. And here in the QE program, the Quaternary Environments, we have several different collections of modern material that we can use to compare to the material recovered out of glaciers and ice patches and lake sediment cores. And so some of the reference material we have in the collection includes seeds and fruits reference collection, over 2,600 specimens. That's basically about 50%, represents about 50% of the vascular plant species in Alberta. And then we have pollen reference collections, which are over 1,000 and represents about 30% of the vascular plant plants. And they are continually growing. We get these reference materials from field collections, but also we get these from donations and also working with herbariums and botanical centers to acquire material for our collections. So this is some images here on the left. We have our microfossils and macrofossils, and these are really well preserved. They don't all look like this from different projects. This is because they're preserved in ice, which is really helpful for our case. And on the right there is the actual reference material we get from modern stuff. So you may ask, why can you take say a seed that's 7,000 years old and compare it to modern stuff? And that's because in Alberta, the plant species have not evolved in that short period of time. What has changed is like when plants arrived in Alberta, their distribution, abundance, and the kind of community structures that they developed. So that's the kind of changes we're looking at. But that is good news for us because then we can use modern reference collections to identify our fossils. And another good thing about that is there's tons of botanists and ecologists that know a lot of information about these plants. And that kind of information is really key to us understanding the environment too. Like what type of conditions does that plant need to grow? And what kind of environment, what kind of other plants does it grow with? So we use that for our interpretations also. So here, I'm going to just go through a couple examples there, and we're nearing the end of this presentation. But this is the kind of macrofossils we're getting. So we take these and we use our reference collection and we identify them to what they are. So this is, the top one is fir, top left, and then the middle one is Engelmann spruce needles, and then the bottom is pink mountain heather leaf. So we can actually take these and identify the type of tree they are, or plant, subshrub, and we can just look at the individual plants and try and understand what the environment looked like from there. So we can look and see, if this plant occurred here, does it need an open environment with no trees, or is it tolerant of some shade, or will it grow right under the canopy? And then we can also understand the tree line. We're talking about looking at those big pieces of wood that we find around the margins. It's really important to understand how these tree lines move over time. So let's just look at an example then from one of these samples. So this is just a little snippet of this sample. It's 4,000 years old. It's from the ice patch we're looking at. And there's many more different species, which just broadens our interpretation understanding. But I just want to show you how we use this. So here we have our pink mountain heather, which we identified from leaves. And then we have our Arctic willow identified from fruits. And those fruits are so well preserved. You have the hairs and everything, as well as lots of leaves from this guy. And then we have lots of mountain avens too that's preserved in these materials. We have a pontella, And then we have this alpine bistort, which is preserved in a type of reproductive structure called a bulbul. So just looking at this very small snippet, these plants have very similar conditions. So we can start painting a picture in our mind of what the landscape looked like 4,000 years ago. These plants are shade intolerant. They need an open space. They have specific requirements of moisture kind of in the middle ground. They're also occurring in alpine higher elevational points in the environment. And then some other features too is a lot of these require that snow depth that they get every year. For example, the willow, the females of flowers can produce more and reproduce more and have better growth if they have that deeper snow. So we can get a lot of information, kind of understand in our mind what that landscape looked like. And also from this, understanding the kind of resources available for both people and animals and what habitats this would provide for different animals too. So then we get something like this, if we compare what we had painted in our head to an image. And from this little snippet, we can see that those macrofossils that were preserved actually represent a modern type of habitat and landscape. It's not unique, which is really not surprising for 4,000 years ago, because by then Alberta had already established its main subregions. Those are the areas composed of certain types of plant communities, like arboreal forest. So that was not surprising. What I didn't show you here, and that's coming out of this research, including this sample, is that there was a real change in tree line dynamics. That's how the trees and the forests were moving downslope or upslope. And around this time, there was a real strong indication of recession, which makes sense because this is a period of overall general cooling, a little bit moisture conditions, and so on. So we can get this kind of information just from a little bit of a sample and understand what is going on. And these are just a few elements we're looking at the ice. And I just want to show you one more before we end here that we're looking at. And also, you know, things that we're looking at too is like bubbles in the ice, which traps gases, which you can then analyze and understand changes in warming and cooling. So there's many elements. We also have mites that we're finding from here, or batted mites. Those are soil mites, and they're really specific to an environment. So we're looking at those elements. Lots of moss, again, those can be quite indicative of the type of environment. And we're trying to accumulate these all together to build a really good, strong interpretation for what these landscapes look like and how they changed. So just highlighting one example of non-plant stuff is Tephra. So Tephra is volcanic ash. The middle image here, if you live in Edmonton, is right along the river valley. So you can actually see a really strong layer of tephra that occurred from eruption that occurred over 7,600 years ago, Mazama, which is now Crater Lake. And in the middle image, it's about a third of the way up the image, and you see this white layer, that's your tephra. When you take a close look at it, it's really fine, looks like kind of flour or ground up chalk, and it's light in color. And then what is that made up of? You can take SEM images, which is at the bottom left corner there, and you can take a look and see that it's mostly composed of glass shard. Now, the cool thing about those glass shards is you can actually look at the morphology and understand what eruption event and source it came from. So if you look at this map that shows you a real interesting thing about Alberta is Alberta doesn't have volcanoes, but we have evidence of volcanic eruptions, and that's through these ash layers, and they come from different sources. So these are quite far away volcanoes typically, but we can see in the profile, and that's really important because these large distinct layers called primary layers can be used as a time marker. So we have a relatively good understanding of when these eruption events occurred, so that if you find, say, an artifact with it or some bone, you understand that it's a specific age or it's younger, older than that eruption event. We are actually finding this in the ice patches also. They're not primary layers, but we're able to identify the eruption events and help form our chronology and our time age model. So it's helpful in that aspect also. So these are just little tiny elements in the ice, and we're looking at many different components. And it's important that we start collecting these samples, because with the changes in climate, a lot of these features are going to be gone in a few decades. So all that information, not just the artifacts that are, melt out, they decay quickly, also all the pollen and the plant material and like the tephra and so on, they're going to be gone. So it's really important that we survey these areas and get this information. And then we can collect that ice, keep it in long-term storage in freezers, and work through them, because it does take a lot of time to count thousands of pollen grains from one little sample and all the macrofossils also. And to end, I have to say, I often just marvel at what these tiny little things preserved in the environment can actually tell us. And I really enjoy looking at them. They're quite neat and fun to work with, and I do enjoy working with plants. And yeah, I just want to thank everyone for joining me during this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'll hand it over to Eleonora to lead us through some questions or discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, Diana. This was a fantastic presentation, and I feel that we all learned so much from the great stories that you share. So thank you again. I actually have a few questions here for you. Okay, so some of our guests would like to know if this presentation is going to be available at some point. And yes, we are recording this presentation, so we're going to do a little bit of editing. We're going to polish it a little bit, and then this will be available for our website. So stay tuned. At some point, we're going to share these with you all. So you can watch that, or perhaps you can share that your friends and families and see how awesome is the research that the Royal Alberta Museum is doing. There is so much behind the scene work going on here. It's just fantastic and extremely inspiring. The other question I have for you is a very technical one. So do you find diatoms in your samples as well?
No, I haven't been looking for them. I'm not sure if they would be in there, but yeah, no. We do a lot of diatom look for in lakes, right? Because they're occurring there. So they take the lake core samples, and there's lots of research, especially at the U of A, around diatoms for sure.
Okay, the other question that I have is, how did you get into this career? It's a very interesting one.
Yeah. But for me, I mean, some people just know what they want to do when they're, 5 years old, which is so cool and admirable. For me, it wasn't straightforward. I've always enjoyed exploring nature and knowing what something is. Like, I enjoyed, what type of animal is that? What beetle? What plants? So my path was, I was in veterinarian medicine. I was hoping to do that as my career. And then I just kind of realized I really enjoyed being outdoors. So that's when I kind of switched gears to working with plants. And then actually my past supervisor and the current director of natural history, Alwyn, she did a presentation at a university class I was taking, and I just got really interested in what pollen can tell us about the environment. So I reached out, and here I am.
That's fascinating. Thanks a lot. I have another question for you. And this time, one of our guests is asking, where in Alberta has your research been located? For example, Jasper, Banff, or other locations?
Yeah, so right now the research I'm doing is strictly in Jasper at this point. So because, for example, one ice patch can give you, 20 organic layers, and those can take a year or more to actually process and get through. But we do definitely hope to expand to other parks in the Rockies.
Okay, and I have once again a very interesting question here. So how do you know that the organic matter, such as trees, weren't moved to locale from elsewhere by ice sheet movement?
Yeah, so because the ice sheets actually destroyed a lot that was in their path, those large ice sheets. So there wasn't these elements, the wood is actually coming from a more recent time. And then also because we're actually dating them. So we know, for example, that small piece of wood found is, you know, about 7,000 years old, and the ice sheets were not around at that time in Alberta. But that's a really good question. So.
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe we can wait for more questions. These are really good questions. Keep them coming. Oh, for sure. Oh, another good one. What does quaternary environments mean?
Oh, it's just encompassing like a time here. So, you know, we only work the last, you know, 12,000 years, but you're looking at millions of years. So it's a geological time frame. So just like you think about Cretaceous and so on. So we do have different researchers at the museum that work at a little bit more in the Pleistocene, which is part of the Quaternary also.
Thank you so much. And next question. This is an excellent presentation. This is the feedback from one of our guests. And our guest is asking if you will be back with another presentation at some point. Looks like you had a really excellent presentation here, very successful.
Oh, awesome. I would love to, and I would love to present information about all the ice, not the ice patch stuff, but also the cave work that we're doing. And looking at macrofossils, we're looking at pack rat dung. That's, you know, some of it's dating back to 10,000 years. So we're looking at macrofossils in there. So hopefully, yes.
That sounds exciting. Thanks a lot. All right, maybe we can give it a few minutes so we can welcome other questions. Oh, okay, one more. Is there an hypothesis as to why so far you're not seeing evidence of the same types of caribou activities on ice patches in Alberta as what it's seen in Yukon? Thank you, excellent question there.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. And it's, you know, it's really complicated by many factors. First of all, we just didn't have the density and populations as caribou as they did in the north. And second of all, it's also kind of like a logistical element because we've only surveyed a very small handful of ice patches. So therefore, those in combination showing that there's no significant use of caribou around these ice patches. But as we look at more ice patches and maybe look at some more of the northern parks in Alberta, we can maybe discover different things. But yeah, that's an excellent question.
Next one. So can you use old photographs to locate former ice patch locations? For example, early surveyor bridgeland photos.
Yes, absolutely. Well, kind of a type of photography. Yes. So there is satellite imagery and there's a lot of work being done. Something I didn't talk about, we don't just go and target an ice patch just because it's there. There is images uses like from satellite to target specific type of ice patches and to also look at where caribou historically ranged and where they migrated through, as well as encompassing where there's traditional routes used by people. So we try and use all those images and that knowledge to select those ice patches so we can get the best outcome. Yeah.
We received many fantastic questions. And one more is coming. So do you think caribou could be popped again here? What can we do for that?
Oh, wow. That's a low question. I'm not an ecologist for caribou, so I'm not sure how much I can answer that. But there's a lot of protection around caribou, and Parks Canada has some really strong programs, including if you've ever gone camping or backpacking in the, you know, in the parks, they protect areas when caribou are moving through and so on. And there's a lot of research being done on caribou diet, DNA, diseases, and so on. So there's a lot of effort.
That's fantastic. Okay. Let's see if we can take some more questions here. But again, thank you very much, Diana. I think that we had a really excellent time learning about your research.
Thank you. I had fun. Thanks for showing up, everyone.
Okay, I guess if we don't have any more questions, well, that's a wrap, my friends. Thank you, Diana, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this talk. We have another talk coming up on May 14. It's called Malignant Plastics, and it's going to explore conservation challenges related to modern materials. So make sure to reserve your spot. And don't forget that many exciting stories and interactive contents are available on the Royal Alberta Museum's website. Oh, actually, I have another question for you. Okay, I have slides of the Mount Edith Cavell from the 1970s. Could you use them?
Maybe, just to, I would like to share with everyone there's something called the Mountain Legacy Project. If you just go search Mountain Legacy Project, and there is this great program where they're taking historical images, mostly done through surveys when they're doing like the boundary surveys and so on, and taking new images of the exact same locations. Like, it's a real technique that they're using, and then they can compare that. And what you can do with those two images is you can actually look at changes in vegetation. You can look at tree line, but you can also look at like how dense the shrubs are getting and so on, and also looking at fire history. So if there's a burning in a site and stuff like that. And these historical images go back about 100 to 150 years. So the Mountain Legacy Project, yes. So this is actually a way we look at, in paleo-environmental studies, we look at that by more of a recent timeline, right? But the cool thing too about it is like tree line is advancing and recessing within a very short period of time. I think that's astonishing, like just, a few decades or a century. Yeah, that's a great question. Just thinking about, Mountain Legacy Project, really awesome.
I'm glad we were able to catch that questions before wrapping up this session. That was really awesome. And we're receiving many interesting feedback from our users. They are thanking you for this interesting presentation, for a super presentation. Some of them are saying.
Thank you.
So, well, thank you so much, everyone, for participating in our very first virtual talk. Others are following, so make sure to check our website for more information and reserve your spot today. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.